Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Frank Miller's film, The Spirit. Now this is a neo-noir film, and it is generally regarded both critically and popularly as quite a crap film, which is not entirely unfair. But I think my slightly controversial position is that it's actually not a bad film. It's a film that you have to take as a spoof, not necessarily of noir films, but of neo-noir films. And so I think if you look at it in that way, it's actually an okay film. It's not the best film ever made. I don't necessarily want to rewatch it over and over again, but it's fine. It's good. So the basic premise of The Spirit is that you have this guy who died and was resurrected. He was resurrected by a guy named the Octopus. We're not really clear why he's called the Octopus. It seems to be a somewhat arbitrary villain moniker in a movie where most of the names are kind of ridiculous. So, like, the female villain, I say villain because she's villainous, but not necessarily a villain. I'll talk more about that. Her name is Sans Serif, and sans serif is a typeface, or is a type of font. So, like, it's a weird thing. The hench person of the Octopus, who's sort of a femme fatale figure, but she doesn't ever really seduce anybody, which is kind of a femme fatale thing, is called Silken Floss. So they're just these weird names. And so I guess the fact that he's called the Octopus for no apparent reason, other than one reference he makes to I've got 8 of everything, though he doesn't seem to. I don't know. I guess the Octopus is a comparatively unoffensive random name in this film of bizarre names. But we start out with the Spirit fighting the Octopus, basically. Like, the Spirit is... the Octopus is the Spirit's nemesis. Both of them are essentially impervious to harm. Like, they do substantial amounts of damage to one another without it having much effect at all. So the Spirit gets shot repeatedly, gets stabbed repeatedly, gets drowned, gets bashed over the head with what appears to be a gigantic wrench. He gets a toilet smashed over his head, etc., etc. And he does the same kinds of things to the Octopus. And then they both just sort of get up, chat for a while, and then walk off. So you immediately, like, have this sense that this is a weird, like, hyper-real spoof. And the thing is, I just don't see a way that you can sort of interpret this as a serious attempt at making a neo-noir film. The only way I can see that makes any sense to read this is as a film that's poking fun at neo-noir as a genre. And of course, Frank Miller is very into neo-noir. Sin City, his film, which had come out a few years before The Spirit comes out, is very much in that vein. A much more traditional in terms of style and approach, but not traditional visually. And I will talk about Frank Miller's visuals in a little bit. But it's much more traditional neo-noir. So, the Spirit is fighting the Octopus, and then they are just done fighting, and they so go their separate ways. The spirit starts investigating. There's some more crimes that are committed, and they're traced back to Sans Serif, who had been the spirit's girlfriend when they were kids, and then her dad and uncle, I think, like killed each other, or her dad was a cop who was accidentally killed by her uncle, who then killed himself, something like that. I don't remember exactly. But anyway, she basically leaves. She becomes a criminal, obsessed with jewelry, and she's obsessed with acquiring a mythical artifact. I'll talk more about that in just a second, because it's an interesting, weird twist that I kind of like. But I'm also a scholar who works primarily on adaptations of Greek drama and Greek myth, so that sort of weird bit really kind of appeals to me. So the octopus, the spirit is investigating that. He doesn't want to believe that Sans Serif could be a murderer, but the evidence is suggesting that she is. Then he gets captured by the octopus, and basically the octopus, he's played by Samuel L. Jackson, by the way, the most brilliant performance of the film, far and away. Some of the other characters are good, some of the other actors are good, but Samuel L. Jackson is by far the reason to watch the movie. So Jackson, the spirit is captured by the octopus, who dresses up as a Nazi, along with Silken Floss, who's also dressed as a Nazi, in this sort of weird, like, Third Reich inspired room. And basically, the octopus explains exactly what had happened, the whole plot. Like, he had been a coroner, a doctor, who had been obsessed with the idea of finding eternal life. He had done a number of experiments and finally gotten it right, he thought, but he was unwilling to test it on himself because, and this is one of the parts of the film I really didn't like, when you get the formula wrong, you basically melt. And so the spirit has a ton of cats, and that's not really ever addressed, except that one cat follows him around throughout a lot of the film. But the octopus gives some of this serum to a cat, which then sort of dissolves. And I, as a cat owner and lover myself, do not under any circumstances approve of violence against cats. I don't like animal abuse in any scenario, but cats especially. So I will take that bold stand. But basically the idea is the serum that... So the spirit who had been Denny Cook, or Denny Colt, sorry, had been killed. He was a police officer, killed on duty. And then when his body was brought in, the octopus, presumably before he was called the octopus and was a supervillain because he was working as a coroner, injected Denny's dead body with this serum. And once he figured out that this worked as a way of sort of reviving the dead, granting eternal life, super quick healing of injuries, etc., the octopus injected himself with the serum. But the serum is unstable, and so he needs the blood of Heracles, which is apparently just kicking around in a vase. So the octopus has tracked this down, and he needs the blood of Heracles because if he drinks that, combined with the formula that he's created, he will become like a god. How exactly that works or makes any sense, or he figured that out, is never explained. So that, again, this is one of the reasons people don't think this is a good film. But the problem is Sans Serif has the vase with the blood of Hercules, or the blood of Heracles in it. And the octopus got the other box, which has what Sans Serif wants, which is the Golden Fleece from Jason and the Argonauts story. So basically they have to do a swap. But they don't trust each other. They're criminals. They're supervillains. So, smart thinking. But they set up this meeting to make the exchange, and then basically everything goes wrong. The spirit shows up with a bunch of police, and there's this sort of fight to the death. The octopus shoots the spirit a massive amount of times, like on probably the order of 40, 50 times. Then the spirit ends the fight basically by grenading the octopus, and it blows him into enough pieces that he can't really recuperate, or shouldn't really be able to recuperate. The Golden Fleece is apparently super impenetrable armor because Sans Serif takes it and like throws it over herself and the spirit to protect them from the grenade blast, and they're just like, yeah, whatevs. Grenade went off 1.5 feet from us and we're totally fine. So that's basically the plot line. It's not all that coherent. A lot of random stuff happens. It doesn't make that much sense, but the other thing that a lot of people take issue with this film, very justifiably, is that pretty much every woman that the spirit meets falls in love with him, and he seems to at least briefly fall in love with them. So there's that whole element of it. The thing is, if you look at this and you want this to be a neo-noir film in its own right, I don't think you get that. I don't think it works. You have to sort of accept all of its goofiness as intentional. That it is over the top. That the dialogue is ridiculously bad. That so much of it is nonsense. But again, it's nonsense specifically intended to poke fun at the conventions of the neo-noir genre. So, for instance, the octopus has these cloned henchmen, right? There's one model of clone, and they just have like random, I guess, names, random words on their t-shirts. They all dress the same, except the word on their t-shirt is different. So the first three we see are ethos, pathos, and logos. Later we see pairings like one will be ranchos, one will be huevos. We see all like just random. The last two we see are named adios and amigos. So like they're weird and random names, but these characters, these cloned characters, are a version of the typical sort of film noir gangster movie henchman. The person who's there, who's like carrying out violence on behalf of the criminal mastermind, but who's incredibly inefficient, and basically whose job is just to screw things up and then die. So we have that, and they're like, the film is very conscious that that's their role, and it presents them self-consciously in that way. So I think we've got that element. And if you think of it as a satire, if you think of it as making fun of the neo-noir genre, the film worked a lot better. But the other thing that's interesting and that's worth talking about with Frank Miller film, any Frank Miller film really, is the visuals. Because Frank Miller has a very distinct cinematic style, and you see this in things like Sin City and 300 and other things that he's worked on. There is a kind of comic book element to it, which of course goes back to Frank Miller's roots in comic books, but he's fascinated by contrast, which again we can trace to sort of film noir, and this sort of chiaroscuro effect that we get with film noir. So, like, he loves stark contrasts of simple colors. So, for instance, we get a lot of scenes where, like, the background will just be black, and then we'll get like the ground that's white, and we'll see the spirit just in sort of a white block, rather than sort of actually sort of fully visual. He'll just run across the screen, and the only color we get in the whole frame is the red of his tie. So we get things like that. We get really distorted scenes, like when the woman Lorelei, who's represents death or something like this, like we get really distorted colors around her, like blues and golds. So we can't see her clearly, but we get this sense that this is some sort of it almost looks drug-induced, but I think a better way of thinking about it might be like, this is the dying synapses of the brain, and things are like misfiring, and we're not seeing things clearly. And so Miller loves those sorts of effects, those really stark contrasts of color, and really sort of sharp distinctions. So it's a visually interesting film. In, again, the same way that so many of Frank Miller's films are.